Alright, today I'm going to be tearing into a 1987 Kawasaki KX250 motorcycle. We're going to tear into the top end. I'm going to go over a couple of those components here, your reed valve assembly. We're going to do your clutches, dig into the clutch assembly, your Kickstarter gear, show you a couple components there, and then go over to your charging system and then end up splitting your case there. Getting into your crankshaft assembly and your transmission. So I'm going to start here by pulling our cylinder head cover off here. Our spark plug is loose. We actually are able to kick this motorcycle over here, and it's got good compression, so I'm curious to see what we've got going on inside our motor here. It does not run. We've got a handful of 12mm bolts around the outside here, and then 3 8mm bolts that we're going to remove. Alright, cylinder head bolts are off there. We're going to go ahead and remove those and set those aside so we don't lose them. Alright, we'll lift our cylinder head up there. We've got your cylinder head here. Inspect this dome, make sure that's in good condition. Replace this gasket. This is a very thick gasket here. You want to make sure this gets replaced every time. You can just take and pull that off, clean this up, make sure that's in good condition. We'll throw this gasket away, and we'll order a new one for the top there. This is your head gasket. Underneath your cylinder is considered your base gasket. So removing your reed valve assembly now, it's over here. We've got your inlet boot here, and then we've got 6 8mm bolts around the outside of this. And take and pull that off. There's your boot there. We've got another gasket here. Make sure that gets replaced. And then we've got your reed valve here. Your pedals are here. These can be replaced either side here. You want to make sure there's no breaks in here, any cracks. You want to make sure that these are closed. Make sure they're not opened up. These are actually in really good condition here. Make sure those are clean before going back together. To get our cylinder off now, we've got 14mm bolts or nuts on the outside here. And then we've got your valve underneath here, 8mm bolts holding this cover on. Pull that off there. All right, once we get these cylinder nuts off of here, the 4 nuts, we can go ahead and remove this cylinder. Now, we can, and you typically want to do this before you remove these cylinder nuts, raise and lower this piston here just by kicking over the Kickstarter. You can inspect those cylinder walls to kind of get an idea what you're dealing with here before you get too far into it. Now, sometimes these piston and cylinders will actually seize up. You won't actually be able to kick these over. If that's the case, you know you're going to have a much more difficult time pulling this cylinder off. This one spins over freely. The walls actually look like they're in great condition. The piston, from what we can tell from the top side here, looks like it's in great condition, but obviously we're going to need to inspect that a little bit more when we get this cylinder pulled off. Now at this time, you can grab a rubber mallet. I take a couple different areas. I'll tap on this, and just being really careful you don't damage any of those areas. If you come in here, hit on this water inlet here, you could potentially break that since it's such a thin-walled pipe there. If you get under here, your exhaust manifold area, or underneath your reed cage here, that's a little bit thicker aluminum. A lot of times you can tap that with a rubber mallet and get that started being pulled up there. And then a lot of times once you get it started, you can just take and work that up with your hands there. Now that is your cylinder there. I'm going to dump out the coolant that we've got in the top, and that's a good thing just to get out of there so you're not dumping that all over your crankcase there. Inspect your top here. You can inspect your cylinder walls. I'll show you in a separate video how to measure those, how to accurately get measurements on your barrel there. That way you can order the correct piston if that's what you need, or order the correct barrel, or take this to a machine shop and get this bored out to the correct sizes there. Your valve on the side here is going to stay inside of your cylinder assembly there, and you can take and move that in and out just like that, and it's going to take and spin these shafts here. Make sure that that's functioning properly, and again, inspect this gasket here, replace it, clean up these surfaces here on the actual crankcase and on the bottom of the cylinder here. This is called your base gasket. Setting that aside, I'm going to pull this piston off at this time. I'm going to grab a pick. With the pick, I'm going to take and shove, there's a grooved end in your piston there. and take it and get that pick inside that groove there, and you can take and I take my finger and put it over top of this hole here so that our shirt clip doesn't go flying across the room. If you're ordering new piston and rings, that set there, they're going to come with new clips. If you order this from Kawasaki, it's probably not going to come with a new piston and clips there. A lot of times those are sold separately when you get them from the manufacturer. Okay, now you can just take your fingers, shove it in through that hole there. You can take and pull that pin out as far as you need to pull it out. That way you can get that piston off of your crankshaft there. There's your bearing. You can, if you're going to reuse this piston, and say you're just replacing the rings, this is as far as you need to go. Actually, if you're just replacing your rings, you can leave this piston on your crankshaft. But I do like to take it off, inspect these bearings. I like to replace these bearings every time you're at least replacing your rings. Typically, I'll go ahead and replace the piston as well while we're doing it because we're here. You are able just to replace those rings. And again, at the same time, I like to replace that bearing. It's inexpensive. It's a good thing to get done while you're this far into it. Our crankshaft is here. We'll get down into that bottom end. You want to be able to spin this over freely. Make sure there's no abnormal noises or catches on there. If there is, obviously we're going to go farther than this. Now to tear into our charging system on this motorcycle, I'm going to tip this engine up here so you can see what we're doing. I got 8mm bolts all the way around the outside. On this particular one, we've got an 8mm bolt holding this shifter on. I think typically they're 10. Pull that out. We can pull this shifter up. All right, we'll get this shifter pulled up here. Now we're going to get into this charging system on this 1987 Kawasaki KX250. Like to make sure our area is clean. That way we're not getting any unwanted dirt and debris down inside our charging system here. 8mm bolts all the way around the outside. Pull those off. And there is your charging system. This is your flywheel here, and behind your flywheel is your stator. That's your magnets are on your flywheel here. Your coils are on your plate here, and that's considered your stator or your magneto or your alternator. Some people call them a generator. That's not the proper term, but some people call them that. And that's what the inside of that case looks like. It looks like this individual here did a liquid gasket around here. Typically, I think there's an actual paper gasket that sits down in there. I could be wrong. Liquid gasket is just fine. But sometimes I'm just curious, if you order a complete gasket kit for your engine, you may receive an actual paper gasket for that. Around this, the wires here, this rubber grommet, you will want to use some sort of a liquid gasket just so that seals up nicely. Got a 12mm bolt here to remove that flywheel. Take and spin that out. That's just regular threads. Also, a washer is going to come with that. Now, we're going to pull this flywheel off. You have to have a special tool to remove this flywheel, and I do sell those. Check out my eBay store. I'll put a link below to those listings. Okay, here's our puller here. You're going to turn this counterclockwise, typically the way that you would turn a bolt out. You're going to turn this one in this direction. So take and spin that on, go as far as you can. Then you're going to take and run this bolt down, and this is going to be regular thread on this puller. Once you get that puller installed there, grab your 18mm socket there, and this will push directly against the crankshaft, and it'll actually lift that flywheel off. There is your flywheel there. We got that pulled off. Inspect these, make sure these magnets and these weights are in good condition. These are replaceable. You've got Phillips heads around the outside there. That is so that you can replace these if need be. Unfortunately, some of the newer models don't have replaceable weights there, and you just have to purchase new flywheels. So we've got our stator underneath up here. This is what creates the power and creates the charge to give your motorcycle the spark. That's why you don't need the batteries on these. We've got 2 Phillips screws here that we're going to remove, and that'll allow us to pull this stator off of the crankcase here. Now you've got a couple other Phillips screws that you can remove to replace these components individually. A lot of times when you purchase this entire assembly, it'll come all as one piece. I believe from Kawasaki you can order these pieces individually, and I would recommend doing a high quality aftermarket stator if that's what you want, as opposed to purchasing a unbranded knockoff stator. Those just don't seem to work properly. You just want to make sure you've got a good charging system on your motorcycle there. So we've got 8mm bolts around the crankcase here. We'll go ahead and pull this clutch cover off the other side and remove that assembly there before we dig into our crankcase. We've got our Kickstarter here. Underneath this cover on this 1987 KX250, we've got our clutch system here. We've got our oil fill cap here. I've done an overview of this motorcycle showing you where to put the oil, how much oil, and some of those specifications. Make sure you check those out. This is your sight glass here. You want to make sure this is in good condition, no cracks or major wear on these seals, so that you can inspect your oil and get that to the proper level there. To remove our Kickstarter here, we've got a 14mm. Go ahead and remove that nut, then we can just go ahead and pull this Kickstarter off of here. This is in very good condition. A lot of times you'll see these splines get worn down, have some damage to them, and then when you slide this on, you've got some serious amount of wobble. This does not have that. Those splines are in great condition. Your Kickstarter gear is in great condition. We've got 8mm bolts around the outside of this clutch cover here. What we have here is your water pump. This underneath here is your impeller. And we've got 3 8mm bolts that need removed here. If we're wanting to drain our cooling system, we've got a 10mm bolt here with a crush washer underneath of it. If you pull this bolt there, a lot of that water is going to come out, or a lot of that coolant is going to come out of our water system, our cooling system on this motorcycle. We've got a gasket here. You want to make sure this surface is cleaned up really well before you go back together. 10mm nut to remove. And this will spin, so I would suggest if you've got an impact, try to use one of those, because you can pull the trigger on one of these and it spins off fairly quickly. If you take a wrench or a socket, try to get that to spin off of there, you're going to have to hold in some spot. You've got potential of breaking a fin off this water pump there, so keep that in mind. I'm now going to finish pulling these 8mm bolts around this clutch cover here. Most of them were already off just to speed things up. We left a couple on there just to show you what we were dealing with there. We've got our valve here. We've got a boot that is covering up this arm. We should be able to leave that valve on there. All right, pulling this off, grab your rubber mallet here, tap on it. That'll allow you to pull that impeller off of there, set those pieces together. And once you've tapped on that, kind of broke that seal free, that gasket there, you're able just to get your fingers in behind there and pull this up. Now I'd like to take and put my thumb on this Kickstarter gear here. A lot of times that'll hold you up. I like to keep that in place down there so we know where those pieces go. Now that is the inside of your clutch cover there. You've got your water pump gear here, and this is what your impeller was sitting on. This is what this impeller and this cover was covering up the other side of this. You've got your valve, and remember when I was tearing apart the top end there, I showed you, you pull this arm here. That's going to move this gear here, this gear that pulls out here. This is for your exhaust valve there. We'll just pull that gear out of there. Now we've got another gasket around here. Make sure those sides are all cleaned up. We'll show you that when we're going back together. Got your entire clutch pack here, and I'm going to show you how to remove that. Grab a 10mm socket and loosen these up. Going back together, do this in a crisscross pattern. And then we'll go ahead and remove these springs so we're not losing any of those. And then I take and pull up on the top plate here. Got that removed. Set that down, grab a screwdriver and a hammer. And we'll tap on this clip here. This clip actually holds that nut in place. All right, we've got an 1 1/16 socket here to remove this larger nut. I go ahead and hold one of these arms with my thumb here and spin that off. You don't want that clutch spinning. You've got other components in here that could jar out of place if you do that. Then once we get that nut removed, we've got our clutch pack ready to come off of there. What I like to do is take and set our plate back down there, set our springs down, and then all of this can come off together. So we'll go ahead and put these bolts back in. And if you're taking and rebuilding your clutch, you would actually take and pry each plate off individually. And what you would do is, obviously these bolts removed, pull this top plate again, pull the friction and the steel plates out together. I like to have my friction plates soaking in oil. That way they're lubricated going back together, so you're not ever running those dry. And then you put those in the same exact pattern that you pull those apart, and you'll slide the grooves down in here. You won't be able to put those in any other way. And then a lot of times if you order an aftermarket clutch kit, you'll be able to replace these springs at the same time. And if springs wear out, your clutch loses its tension, and your bike won't run quite right. So that is your entire clutch pack assembly. Here is your entire basket. And these baskets tend to get grooved. This one happens to be in really good condition. And you want to make sure that there's no wear or damage to these gears here. You want to make sure that all of these, if you are using these this clutch pack again, make sure that your friction and steel plates are in good condition. Those do warp. I've done several videos on how to check to see if those are warped or not. That's a common issue. If your clutch gets too hot, you'll start warping your steel plates. Now, a lot of times that happens at the same time that your friction plates go bad, because your friction plates then are just wearing essentially metal on metal. It's not metal material, but it gets very, very hot, can warp those plates. Pull the Kickstarter gear out here would be the next step to getting down into our bottom end. We've got a bearing that sits in behind your clutch basket, so I'm going to set those with each other. Also, these parts here that I pulled out, I'm going to set in there. Okay, what I like to do is grab a pair of pliers here very, very carefully so you don't ruin these threads. I'll put actually the teeth of my pliers into the splines of that gear. And you want to make for certain sure that your pliers are not going to slip off of here. You're going to damage those splines. So I take and turn that back. That's going to tighten that spring. You're able to slip that off. What you're doing here is this arm that releases your Kickstarter gear that sits right here, you're actually pulling that away from the back there. So it'd be very, very hard to take and pull this with your fingers that direction. You can take and put a rag underneath of there. I found if as long as I've got pliers with good teeth and I've got a good firm grip on there, this is the best way for me to do it. Now, you putting a grease rag behind there might be the ticket. The problem with that is sometimes you get that to slip, rips right through your grease rag there, and you start damaging those threads. So just be very, very careful doing that. Going back together, I'll show you a couple tricks on getting that done. You want to inspect this, make sure it's in good condition, make sure your ratchet's in good condition there, and all those teeth are in great condition. When you kick that Kickstarter arm, that would typically be up here, this one here sits right here. Kick this down, it's going to kick this gear this way, it's going to engage your idler gear here, it's going to engage your clutch, which engages your crank, which starts your motorcycle. As soon as you let off that arm, it's going to flip back into position here, and that ratchet is no longer going to be connected in the back there. You can see that when it's out, you're no longer engaging that Kickstarter. That's when you push your Kickstarter down, you're actually sitting there spinning this direction and wearing those teeth down. Now, it's not going to, this way your teeth doesn't actually grab. The gear is meant to go that direction. So it's not a terrible deal, but you don't want your Kickstarter held down for a long amount of time, or it's going to really heat that gear up and damage that. It's not meant to go in that direction for long periods of time. Minimal amount of time is fine, long periods of time, not good. So you kick that down, it grabs that gear, grabs that idler, grabs that clutch, grabs that crankshaft, starts your motorcycle, let off of it, it's going to go back to the idling position there. That's kind of a quick overview of your Kickstarter gear. Next, I'm going to grab some snap ring pliers here. We've got a snap ring on your idler gear. You've also got a snap ring on your primary gear there. Go ahead and remove that gear, set that aside. Underneath of there, we actually have another snap ring. So keep in mind, if you're splitting your crankcase, you're going to need to remove that snap ring as well. And those they look like the same exact snap ring, so we shouldn't need to keep track of which one goes where. This is a slightly different snap ring, so you will want to keep track of where this one goes. This doesn't actually have holes for your snap ring pliers to fit into. They're just grooves. It makes it sometimes a little more of a challenge to pull off of here. A lot of times what I do, if I have a snap ring like this, I'll actually take and put my screwdriver underneath and hold that up. That way I can get my snap ring pliers in there again and get a new grip on it. Pull that off. There's your snap ring there. We'll set that aside. Now we're able to take our primary gear, pull that off. There's your gears there. Two different gears. This one will need to be lined up. You see a line there. This one doesn't really matter which direction that goes on. We've got our shift mechanism here. We can take and pull this out. This is your shift shaft. This is where shifter pedal will go on the left-hand side of your motorcycle. We'll wipe that down, make sure those splines are in good condition. Remember, I took an 8mm, pulled that shifter lever off. Here's the shift lever there. Those were attached. When you shift up, it's actually turning your shift star here and changing gears inside your transmission. Shift down, same thing. Here you can see it's in the neutral position. On this shift drum here, you've got different gears. So neutral's here. That's why it's a half gear. That's why it's a lot of times harder to get it into neutral, is because it's just a little bit of a groove compared to these other grooves. So we've got neutral, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. So this has 6 gears. Neutral, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. That is the shift pattern there. We're going to now flip this crankcase over, and I'm going to go ahead and start removing 8mm bolts around that crankcase. Here's your shift release rod there. You want to make sure this is in good condition. It looks like it doesn't matter which direction you put this, they're going to be identical. But on the other side, you've got where your clutch, on this side here is where your clutch arm comes in. So when you pull your clutch lever, it's going to actually push this out. So your clutch cable's coming in here. It's going to take and push this out. It's going to push against your clutch. It's going to push against this piece here. It's going to disengage your clutches. You let your clutch lever go. It's going to go back in. It's going to start grabbing those friction and steel plates again. It's going to engage that clutch. So pull in that lever. That's going to push those plates out. Let go. That's going to allow those plates to come back together. So that is why if your clutch is slipping, you're going to be like in the halfway point there, and your clutches isn't going to grab firm enough, and you're going to end up wearing those friction and steel plates off very, very quickly. So you want to make sure that those are in good condition. If they're bent or a piece is broken off, your clutch isn't going to function like it should. You're going to end up destroying your friction and steel plates. We've got a couple more shift components here I'm going to remove before I flip this engine over. Got an 8mm here for your arm that's spring loaded. Make sure you keep track of where those parts go and what they are. I'll just show you what those are there. And then the shift star that I was talking about earlier. What I like to do with our shift star is I'll take and actually turn that to the position where it's actually stuck, because what I don't want to do is take and spin this over really hard and break our shift forks off or break our shift drum. So I'll take and turn that to the position that it stops, and then I'll put our impact on there. If you are, say, in this position here, you take and put your impact on there and slam your trigger, that is going to take and jerk that shift star back the other direction. Could potentially break some parts inside that transmission. We'll take and remove this star. We need to do that before we split that case. Here's a close-up of what that looks like there. Again, neutral is here. First, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. The other thing I want to pull off before we flip this crankcase over is our Kickstarter arm here. You don't need to remove this Kickstarter arm if all you're doing is digging into your transmission here or replacing your crankshaft. This arm can stay, and I would suggest leaving it on there. It's got thread lock there. You do not want this arm coming loose, or you're going to have some serious issues with your Kickstarter. But because we're tearing this motor completely down to clean it up, I'm just going to remove that piece. Not a big deal. These bolts here also can come out, but if you're splitting the case, your crank or your primary shaft here is going to come out the other direction, so you don't actually have to remove those bolts. Flipping this crankcase over, again, we've got a lot of 8mm bolts here around the outside. Okay, it looks like we have 12 bolts here in our crankcase, and a lot of times what I'll do is I'll take, and if I'm putting this motor right back together, I'll take and start in one spot that I can remember. So we may start on the back of the cylinder, and we'll just go ahead and start putting these in order. We've got a couple bolts that are kind of in the middle, so you can just kind of decide how you want to do those. And it's looking like all these bolts are the exact same size. So we'll see if that's true all the way around. All of them are. So all those bolts are the same size. Doesn't matter where you start on this one. They're all going to be the same. So I'm going to flip this up. I'm going to take and move these shift parts over so we don't ruin those, or so we don't lose those there. And then I'm going to grab a rubber mallet and tap on them. What you'll be tempted to do, and what you want to try to refrain from doing, is grabbing a hammer or a screwdriver and start prying on these crankcases. You'd be better off if you just slowly lift this off of here, even with a rubber mallet here. Even if it takes a little bit longer, you run the risk of destroying that crankcase as well as gears on the inside. So you want to try to refrain from doing that. When you're splitting that case, a lot of times you can keep those gears either one side or the other. This doesn't look like it's going to happen this time. So I'm going to end up pulling a lot of gears out with this crankcase, which isn't the end of the world. You just got to pay attention to where that stuff falls and make sure that you put those gears right back in the right position there. Crankshaft is here. We've got our gears on this side. We've got our gears on this side. We've got two different sets of shift forks here, and we've got our shift drum. So shift drum looks like it's in good condition there. Moving our transmission to this side, I like to make sure that those gears kind of stay in order there. Even if they kind of fall out of alignment, you can take and adjust those at any time. Take our shift fork here, pull that out. Do the same thing over here. A lot of times if you take and pull that shaft up, you can take and slide that shift fork out of there, and then you can take, and you may need to grab a rubber mallet or something and tap from the other side to get this the rest of the way out. Looks like that's where we're sticking here. And I think there's actually an O-ring on there that was holding us up. We'll go ahead and pull this shaft out. This is where your clutch sits there. Our crank shaft, now we can take a rubber mallet, tap on it this way, and go ahead and tap this crankshaft all the way out. We've got our arm here for our clutch. We can just pull that out. There's sometimes a bolt here, depending on which direction this is sitting. This bolt can hold that in there. We'll set that aside. I'm going to go ahead and take and tap out this gear set here. Move that transmission gear set as well. So that is the crankcase split on a 1987 KX250. If you guys have questions or comments, make sure and leave those below. If the video has been helpful, make sure you like, subscribe, and share. I appreciate you guys watching.